Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the Wilmot
To
Proviso.
understand the significance of the Wilmot Proviso, you need to keep in mind the context, which will include everything from the free soil movement, the Congressman David Wilmot, who presents this, and the Mexican American War. The Free Soil Crusade was all about stopping slavery from expanding west. It really gets going in 1846 because we're going to get all kinds of new territory from Mexico, and you're going to have to think about, well, can people bring slaves into those areas? Some people like David Wilmot were like, hell's no.
Wilmot was a Democrat who wanted Martin Van Buren for president in 1844, but Martin Van Buren was knocked out of the Democratic primary because it came to light during the election that he did not support the annexation of Texas. A different Democrat won the primary and the general, a fellow who rode in on a horse called Manifest Destiny.
That is a man with a mullet, the president known as James Knox Polk.
Now, I've noticed in some of the responses that I've gotten from students that there is some confusion about what James K. Polk does with Texas. The Texas Revolution was fought before this period. That was about people in Texas establishing their independence from Mexico. The Texas Revolution was fought over a variety of issues, one of which was definitely slavery.
Sam Houston was then elected the first president of Texas in 1836.
Many Texans wanted to become part of the United States from the beginning, Sam Houston included. Many of the people who had settled in Texas had originally been Americans, and it was like, yeah, we essentially have American values, so let's join up. That was rejected by the United States in the 1830s because no one wanted to annoy Mexico. And there was an idea that we would probably have to go to war with Mexico if we annexed Texas, because there were some border disputes that still existed between the countries of Mexico and Texas, which will bring us to the Mexican-American War.
This conflict began a full 10 years after the Texas Revolution. It opened up in 1846 and ended in 1848. Let's just take a moment to think about how annexation of Texas went down, which was the main reason that the Mexican-American War did break out.
John Tyler, who was an extremely unpopular president, decided to annex Texas to maybe boost his popularity. This didn't really work out for him, though. This was in the last kind of days, and he left office, and James K. Polk rode in, and he was like, all right, I'm going to continue forward with the Tyler plan, and this means that, well, I'm probably going to have to go to war with Mexico.
There were people who felt that if you did go to war with Mexico, you would not only get Texas, you could get other territory, because there was some unrest stirring in an area of the world that we now call California. And the Bear Flag Revolt, which will have a lot to do with a fellow named John C. Fremont, will be subsumed into the Mexican-American War. And, well, just essentially a whole bunch of people like Abraham Lincoln thought that this was a territory grab.
James K. Polk would have been like,
it's our manifest destiny, guys. I hear what you're saying, but we're going to stretch from sea to shining sea. So, tally-ho.
Mexican-American War did indeed break out. The United States won, and we had a whole bunch more territory, and Texas became part of the United States, now a state, not a country. And there's a whole lot of land that we got to think about that we didn't have to think about before, because, as you recall, going all the way back to the Missouri Compromise, we had at one point figured out where slavery had to be contained and where it could expand, because we had created a demarcation line between free and slave territory. Well, that didn't apply to the Mexican lands. This brings us back to David Wilmot and the Wilmot Proviso, which was what again? I don't think I've ever told you. The Wilmot Proviso said that there would be no expansion of slavery westward. It was already in Texas. You can't do anything about that. That's a slave society. But there's lots of territory that is not settled, and you should not be able to take slaves into those areas as new states are formed. Now, I want to take a second to talk about something that is difficult to wrap our minds around in the 21st century, because, of course, today we look back at slavery and are ashamed that this institution ever existed in our country. But in the 1800s, this was still super mainstream. You had some abolitionists, for sure, but those guys were the most extreme people within what became the Free Soil movement. The Free Soilers had different reasons for not liking slavery, and some of them had very little to do with liberty for the slave. When proposing the Wilmot Proviso, David Wilmot wanted to stop the expansion of slavery west because he felt that slavery hurt white workers. This is very much related to Hinton Helper, who wrote a book about this that was banned in the South. Hinton Helper's like, look, guys, I understand you live in slave societies and there's this caste color system, but if you are a poor white farmer who doesn't have anything, does it really help you to have slaves working on these big plantations, making it literally impossible for you to be able to produce what you need to produce at a cheap enough level to compete with these big owners? This argument against slavery had a lot of purchase, especially with poor people who were going westward to engage in, say, the gold rush in California. Miners are not going to want to have slaves in California competing with them, because if you're just a guy out there with your little pan in the stream, how in the world are you going to be able to take control of an area and work up against this slave owner who has hundreds of people that he doesn't even have to pay just descending? Now, I want you to also think about something else. So this Free Soiler argument is not one based on human rights. At least it's not based on an argument about how Black slaves have human rights. If you are a slave or you are an abolitionist, are you going to object to someone who says slavery shouldn't expand west because it hurts poor white workers? No. You're going to be like, yeah, that's exactly right. You're right. It hurts poor white workers. Let's focus on that, because what you care about is abolishing slavery. And a good step in that direction is not letting it go westward. You understand, as soon as people start getting used to the concept of freedom in the Western territories, you might even take the arguments about slavery hurting poor white people back east again, back into the slave states. And then you can start chipping away at that horrible institution where it was firmly planted. You know who understood that this could be a backdoor to trying to end slavery throughout the entire country?
not just abolitionists who just hated slavery because it was an affront to humanity, but slave owners who thought that freedom for the slave meant a contradiction of property rights.
Another thing to see here is this issue was not concentrated in one political party or the other. At this point, you have the Whigs and the Democrats, and the Whigs are having all sorts of issues. They're becoming super factionalized, which will lead to the Know-Nothings and the Republicans later. But Whigs in the North supported David Wilmot's Proviso, even though David Wilmot was a Democrat. Whigs in the North believed that unregulated competition between slave and free labor in the territories should be stopped. Whigs in the South, however, lived in slave societies, and they're like, nah. Democrats in the North were free soilers. Democrats in the South were slavers. Regionalism is becoming more and more and more problematic. The Wilmot Proviso is killed. It's not going to go into effect, but all of the questions are still there. What are we going to do about slavery and westward expansion? Maybe you could extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific and say anything north is going to be free, anything south is going to be slave. But Northerners didn't like that because there was more land south. A guy named Lewis Cass proposed something called popular sovereignty or squatter sovereignty, so that people forming new states could make up their own minds. This was very popular with Democrats. But nothing was decided when James K. Polk left office after serving his one term. So what happens? Well, people are going to battle it out in the political sphere. The candidates for president in 1848 are interesting. The first came up with the popular sovereignty idea. That was a fellow named Lewis Cass. He was a Democrat. He is also known as the most handsome man to have ever been in American politics. And here I am completely joking. Poor Lewis. Next up is Zachary Taylor. He ran as a Whig. He had no political experience whatsoever, which would make you think, why'd they choose him? Well, he'd been a general in the Mexican-American War, and Americans tended to like generals. They liked military leaders. Think Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison. He was also quiet on the slavery question, though he promised not to veto any legislation dealing with the issue that Congress passed. So Northern Whigs felt, well, he's not radical one way or the other. He was a Southerner who owned slaves, so the South didn't complain about him. He was essentially a compromise candidate, a blank slate onto whom you could project anything you wanted. Then there was a third party. A bunch of the Wilmot Proviso supporters didn't like either Zachary, I don't know what we're doing, but I'm a badass, Taylor, or Lewis, let the squatters decide, Cass. They got together a convention led by former President Martin Van Buren. Remember, David Wilmot had supported him earlier, and formed a new party, the Free Soil Party, which came out of the Free Soil movement. Martin Van Buren used to be a Democrat, like Lewis Cass, so Van Buren and Cass ended up splitting the Democrat vote, which is often what happens when a third party is created during a presidential election. Taylor, as a consequence, won. Yay! But Zachary Taylor will not always do what people think he will do, even though he had no record for which they could judge his doings. For a quick example, Zachary Taylor didn't think that slavery should expand into California and New Mexico. Unfortunately for Zach Taylor, he's going to die while in office, and you need to pay attention to how that impacts the passage of legislation that does try to deal with this question of westward expansion of slavery, and how all of this is just setting up what's going to be the bloodiest war in U.S. history. There's a little foreshadowing. Bye.